Hello and welcome to the local campaign. I'm Gord Martineau from City News. On October 19th, Canada will elect the 42nd Parliament of this country, and Rogers TV is the only station producing debates of all of Toronto's 25 ridings. For the next hour, you're going to hear from the candidates of Etobicoke Centre. Before I introduce the candidates, let's take a closer look at the riding of Etobicoke Centre.
The riding of Etobicoke Centre is bordered by the city of Mississauga on the west, a large portion of the Humber River to the east, Eglinton Avenue West and Dixon Road to the north, a portion of the CN rail line and Burnham Thorpe Road on the south. Neighborhoods in this riding include Markland Wood, Princess Anne Manor, Richview Gardens, and Humber Valley Village. Centennial Park is the largest landmark in this riding. This 530-acre area has numerous sports and recreation facilities that attract residents from the riding and beyond. The incumbent MP is Conservative Party member Ted Opitz.
Now we'll give each candidate 1 minute to make their opening statement, and this will be done in the order of most seats by the party in the House of Commons. And we will begin with Ted Opitz. Ted?
Thank you, Gord, and thank you to Rogers for hosting this series of debates. I've been proud to serve Etobicoke Centre as its MP, and I thank the people of Etobicoke Centre for giving me that opportunity. In these past 4 years, I've been very proud to be part of a Conservative government that has lowered taxes, put more money into the pockets of seniors and families, balanced the budget by lowering taxes, lowest in 50 years, as well as getting a $1.9 billion surplus a year ahead of schedule. We did all of that, and we're going to continue to do more. We've made record investments in infrastructure, $85 billion over 10 years, and we're going to still continue by investing in Smart Track, $2.6 billion, and a re-elected Conservative government will invest significantly in the Toronto Transit Commission because Etobicoke Centre needs transit options. I've also been very proud to work internationally in Poland, Ukraine, and for the people of Somalia and helping that nation rise up onto its feet. Gord, you know, Etobicoke Centre deserves a lot more than the previous Liberal government ever delivered, and this Conservative government moving forward will continue to do that. We are one of the most respected countries in the world. The Reputation Institute just put out a survey in Forbes that demonstrates that entirely. So I'd like to thank you for this opportunity, and I'd like to
All right, thank you. Next candidate is Tanya de Mello of the NDP.
Thank you, Gord, and thank you all for watching. My name is Tanya de Mello, and I'm honored to be your NDP candidate for Etobicoke Centre. I am running with Tom Mulcair, and I am your candidate for change. Here's what I'm ready to do as your MP if elected. I'm a Princeton-educated economist who won a Fulbright scholarship to represent Canada. I worked for Deloitte and Touche as a consultant, and later with the United Nations with refugees all over the world. I am now a human rights lawyer, and I work at the University of Toronto. What I'm offering to the people of Etobicoke Centre is deep expertise in economic and fiscal planning, but at the same time, I have an understanding of community organizations, and I know the importance of social priorities. Thomas Mulcair and the NDP, and along with me, Tanya de Mello, your candidate, will bring you $15 a day affordable daycare. We'll bring back respect and dignity for our seniors who have built this country, and we'll actually invest in long-term transit and infrastructure solutions. My two major opponents have had this job before, but they failed to deliver on their election promises. So what we are offering you is change for Etobicoke Centre and change in Canada. On October 19th, vote for Tom Mulcair, vote for the NDP, vote for me, Tanya de Mello, as your Etobicoke Centre representative.
Next candidate is Borys Wrzesnewskyj of the Liberal Party. Boris?
Ladies and gentlemen of the viewing audience, you and I have something in common. We care. We care about our local communities, and we care a great deal about our country, Canada. And what's happened to Canada over the past Harper decade? We have increasing social divisions, increasing democratic deficit, increasing environmental degradation, increasing international jingoism. The only thing that hasn't increased is our economic performance. We have a moribund economy, 200,000 more Canadians out of work, 170,000 young Canadians unable to find work, and a debt to GDP ratio that's gone up. And what's Mr. Harper saying? He's telling us, stay the course. Well, fundamentally, he's saying that we can't do better. Friends, we didn't become the best country on the planet by saying we can't do better. We can do better, we must do better, and fundamentally what this election is about is reclaiming the promise of Canada, a Canada that the rest of the world look to as a shining example of what in fact is possible.
Rob Wolvin of the Progressive Canadian Party, you're next.
Hi, my name is Rob Wolvin, and I'm your PC candidate in Etobicoke Centre. I grew up in Etobicoke Centre when I lived at St. Stephen's Court at Humbertown, and I went to Humber Valley. My grandfather had Otto Jelinek, PC candidate, on his lawn. When I was in high school at Etobicoke Collegiate, I was also a part-time dishwasher. And I worked downstairs from the riding office when Michael Wilson was first elected PC candidate for Etobicoke Centre. I served on his youth executive. I carry the flag for the Progressive Conservative Party. And the last time we had a PC government, a real conservative government, small c conservative like so many Canadians, an alternative to the Liberal Party without jolting our country in some bizarre direction, there were people who were optimistic about the future, people who believed that hard work could make a difference. Now 75% of Canadians in Toronto don't believe that hard work and determination can mean success. We need to change that.
All right, we will now begin our question and answer period of the debate. Each candidate will be given 30 seconds to respond, followed by some discussion. Now, let's get to a question particular to Etobicoke Centre, and that is unemployment. Manufacturing jobs have been disappearing, going elsewhere. What are you going to do to change that?
Well, Gord, you know, we're working as a government very, very hard making sure that, that we increase jobs, we increase employment in Canada through our good, solid economic policies by making sure that we have a balanced budget and a surplus. But also, this has to also be laid at the feet of Kathleen Wynne. The Ontario Liberal government has shed 300 to 400,000 good manufacturing jobs simply by their poor management and simply by raising taxes on the back of people in the Etobicoke Centre and across Ontario.
Tanya.
I think we have to put responsibility where it's due, and that's due at the federal level. Stephen Harper's track record on jobs is atrocious, and we have lost more than 300,000 jobs than when he was first in office. It's appalling. Our manufacturing sector has been decimated, and we haven't put in training and skills to retrain the workers so that they can work effectively elsewhere. The NDP is committed to that training and to increasing our manufacturing jobs.
Borys?
As Ms. Mello said, our manufacturing sector in Southern Ontario has been decimated. There's a rust belt. And this current TPP trade deal threatens one of our key industries in Southern Ontario, the auto industry. 80,000 good quality jobs. But let's bring it down to the local in Etobicoke Centre. In Etobicoke, we have swaths of areas that have hundreds of small, medium-sized industrial businesses like my own, that depend on efficient distribution systems. We can't have that with permanent gridlock in the GTA. We haven't had any major investment in public transit during the Harper decade. It's time to change that.
Rob.
As Borys has mentioned, there's a big problem with people in terms of infrastructure, and there needs to be much more investment. We haven't had a subway come out to Etobicoke since Kipling Station in the early 80s, and that's not acceptable. There needs to be more infrastructure investment, and it's not good enough for a government to use slogans and to promise infrastructure investment and not get the money out the door, or to only place that money in a not particularly efficient manner in ridings that it thinks it can win in the next election. We need to plan for the future, not just the next election.
Two of you mentioned an issue that I think is important not only to your ward, but to everyone in the GTHA, and that is public transit. The TTC is woefully underfunded. It is the least subsidized transit system, public transit system in North America. Successive politicians have punted the issue down the road, passed the buck, not done anything about it. Let the next guy figure it out. What are you going to do to change it? What are you going to do to improve the Toronto Transit Commission, or at least in as much as it concerns Etobicoke Centre?
Well, you're right, Gord. The TTC must be enhanced. And a re-elected Conservative government, Stephen Harper just recently said, is going to invest significantly in that. But that's also going to be part and parcel of John Tory's Smart Track. I think it's a very, very good plan to aggregate all the transport possibilities that we have, from subways to buses to trains and so forth. And Etobicoke Centre needs to have those options brought into it, because many of our roads are poor. Under a former Paul Martin government, I would add that they, when they balanced the budget, they did it on the backs of the provinces, took away transfer payments, and consequently, by doing that, they also took away money from municipalities and therefore transport.
Tanya.
One of the biggest impacts that I see as an economist to business in Etobicoke Centre because of transit is the commute times. So it's not just people taking the subway and transit, the TTC, it's also people that have to drive, that don't have a choice but have to drive. We're looking at wait times, commute times, similar to LA and New York, 1 to 2 hours a day. It's unacceptable. The NDP has talked about actually investing in a national transit strategy. So we're not throwing money at the problem, but putting in $1.13 billion a year so that we work with municipalities so that they can actually tackle the problem.
Borys?
What's interesting is after a decade in power, after the Harper decade, all of a sudden before an election where the GTA is playing a critical role, they've discovered Smart Track. It's not believable that all of a sudden they've reprioritized towards public transit. And what's especially difficult is the fact that in Etobicoke, the average Etobian in this last decade is spending 45 extra minutes commuting every day. There's a cost to that, besides the personal frustrations. There's a cost to our local neighborhoods. Frustrated commuters zip through our side streets. And there's an environmental cost. And there's an economic cost, as I mentioned, to Etobicoke businesses. And it didn't have to be that way. Major public transit infrastructure usually takes a decade or so to build. And we had a new deal for cities back in 2005. A year it took us to sign agreements with all the provinces across this country, including with Ontario. And I was part of the GTA working group, the caucus group, on this issue.
Time's up. Rob, what are you going to do to improve transit service in Etobicoke?
Well, I think that the biggest problem with public transit issues is the lack of investment and the lack of sustained investment. The ideological view that government can't be involved is just simply impractical. And it's recognized in major cities throughout the world that 70% of the cost of public transit being covered by riders is absurd and unacceptable. That the investment that would allow a higher percentage of the cost to be covered by governments, all three governments working together, has an economic advantage that more than compensates for the cost.
Another issue that is pertinent to Etobicoke Centre is air traffic. Pearson International Airport. A lot of people are suggesting that night flights have to be strictly regulated, and that the volume of traffic, which has been increased by 50%, should be turned back to the levels that it was in 1997. What will you do? And I advise you that when one of you is speaking, another one can jump in and challenge whatever it is they're saying. How are you going to regulate traffic?
Well, first of all, this began with the Liberal government. It began with Jean Chrétien, who privatized the GTAA and allowed the night flights to begin in the first place and put the escalator clause on it. I have brought two ministers of transport to the riding to examine the problem. I've been talking to the group within the riding that is most concerned about this in Markland Wood, and we have been working towards solutions. And quite frankly, recently, Lisa Raitt, the Minister of Transport, has made a statement and has asked all industry players to work together, whether it's with the GTAA, with NAVCAN, and all airline industry players to further consult with the community in a much more meaningful fashion than has done in the past. This is happening right now. These consultations have already happened, and I've been hearing very, very good things from people who have attended these. And NAVCAN is now going to work much more closely.
You're shaking your head. Why?
I need to interject. The people of Markland Wood are infuriated. There are 38 night flights now every night that go through our airports, right over the heads of our residents. This is a 20% increase that was voted on by the Conservative Party, who actually went in camera so that the public couldn't see the votes, couldn't see the discussion, and we came out with a 20% increase in night flights. The NDP was the party that put forward the motion to stop the increase. And if I can tell the viewers out there, the reason this is so upsetting is because other major international airports, such as Frankfurt Airport, which is a major hub, has 0 night flights. There are politicians that believe you can have economic growth but still respect the needs of your neighbors. And the Conservative Party has done nothing to help with the decrease in night flights.
What are you going to do?
Well, I'll introduce the 3 pieces of legislation that I introduced during the Conservative minority governments to ban night flights. We don't just want to freeze night flights.
Ban them outright.
Ban them outright, just as we've seen in places like Frankfurt. And under Mr. Opitz, during his term, we've seen an increase in night flights. Decisions made in camera. In fact, there was a previous decision that Mr. Opitz voted on with the Conservative majority and Transport Committee that would have prevented community input during discussions of expansion of operations and construction, similar to what happened in Heathrow when they were building another runway. You had the local MPs engaging with communities. Mr. Opitz voted against community input. Night flights have increased during his term, and he's done nothing. When he talks about community consultation, the community found out secondhand, actually no, thirdhand, that night flights had increased. That's not engaging the community.
Mr. Opitz, you're not defending yourself here. What's going on?
I was just being polite and letting my opponent complete his sentence. No, I have had town halls with the community. I have brought in NAVCAN. I've brought in GTAA. We've had meetings at the airport authority. We have I've brought the ministers in to talk and directly talk to the people most concerned about this across the riding. We're working very hard to mitigate this. Minister Wright has now put forth her plan to make sure that the community is far more engaged in this issue than it ever has been, that NAVCAN and all the key industry stakeholders engage with the community. They must do this because it's important, and it's become a wider issue.
I'm hearing a great deal about discussion. You know, the people of Etobicoke are saying, when is actually something going to get done? You're shaking your head.
I have some observations on this subject that I'd like to make.
Yeah.
I think that the night flights, I think it's irresponsible to just simply say we don't want night flights, let's ban them. I think that they're horrible for the residents, particularly in places like Markland Woods, but I think we need to look at the reason why those are existing, and it's because of the increased volume at one airport. Major cities of this size, especially ones with the irresponsible development without accompanying investment in infrastructure, that's why we're in this position. There should be another airport to take the pressure off the volume that is going through Pearson.
Just to that point, actually we can outright ban night flights at GTA. Most of those flights are cargo flights, and they could go into Hamilton Mountain Airport. I've visited Hamilton Mountain Airport, discussed it with the key individuals
people
there.
Of Hamilton are going to feel
Yeah,
when you're
exactly.
But it's
increasing
mostly farmland. We have residences abutting the GTAA. Around Hamilton Mountain Airport, it's mostly farmland, and they'd be happy to take those FedEx cargo planes coming into their airport. So we do have another option.
And we also have plans from the Ontario provincial government and potentially a more reliable partner federally that could work to complete the infrastructure of fast track between some of the outlying closer cities. If we take the pressure off Pearson, that doesn't necessarily mean that those cargo planes are flying into Hamilton at night or flying into some other airport at night. They can be flying in during the day in airports that are not as clogged with traffic as Pearson. I think that's the way to remove, not just ban it.
I'd like to add 2 things. The first is this comment from Ted Opitz that we've had consultation. The people of Etobicoke Centre have not felt consulted. And my biggest question to the Harper government is, if you've consulted so much with the people of your community, then why are you holding the discussions in camera so the public can't know what's been said and the public can't know what's been voted? What I will say that Ted Opitz brought up that is important is that This kind of privatization and the decision to favor corporate interests over public residents started with the Liberal government. And that's important because one of the things I'm struggling with consistently is hearing my colleague Borys constantly promising wonderful things like we will ban all night flights in Etobicoke. And then when they're actually voting and when they're actually making decisions in the Liberal government, they're voting very similarly with the Conservatives.
Well, Mr. Mello, actually on that point, 3 times I've introduced legislation motions in the House dealing with this issue to ban night flights. So I actually have acted on this. And I take no responsibility for previous governments of the past, Mr. Chrétien, etc. During my term, I acted. And when we do a contrast and compare, what we have are, as you said, in-camera meetings, and fundamentally, we don't know. Mr. Opitz, did you vote in favor of increased night flights? Because that's what we have.
Well, Mr. Wrzesnewskyj, you had 7 years to do something. Your government had since '93. It's
And
your government that
blocked my motion.
It's your government that put this in place in the first place. And you know, you like to say that you've done this and that, but you knew that under your government, who put this in place in the first place, that you never would have had a chance of making this happen. And you're also assuming an awful lot about the people in Hamilton.
Why assume that you don't have a chance? That's the kind of attitude that you've brought into government.
You got to be honest with your
constituents. You don't have a
constituents.
chance of changing
You got to
things.
be
I
honest
believe
with your
you
constituents.
can make positive change.
You were there for
your
7 years,
I
and there
think
was
people
no
are tired
change.
of hearing
And 5.5
so-called
and
conservative
5.5
we've had enough
Liberal
overlap
Party
here.
talk
One at a
about
time.
what happened
Yes.
in
One
the
at a time.
past.
Yes.
What were you
We
saying?
have a situation today. What could we do about it to change it and make it better? So what Borys did, what Ted did, I don't think it's as much an issue as what we're going to do now, because this is the situation we're faced with.
Let's talk about immigration. The Syrian crisis has dominated news coverage, as you know. The requirements to become a Canadian citizen have become much more difficult. Therefore, more people are finding it more difficult, or less likely to be immigrants of Canada. Should we be opening the doors a little wider to accommodate people such as the Syrian refugees?
Gord, we do. We've been resettling 1 in 10 refugees around the world. Canada has a tremendous track record of doing this. You know, it's been out in the media recently that over 23,000 Iraqis and Syrians. I've helped people within my own office just recently as well come into Canada. But there has to be a 3-part plan, because you're also talking about Syria and the crisis that's going on in the Middle East and the migrant crisis that's happening in Europe. And what we need to do is, yes, we need to bring refugees in. This government, a re-elected Conservative government, will bring them in faster, but we also have to ensure that that we fight ISIL and that we make sure that people coming to this country
Tanya
are
DeMello,
safe.
what would you do?
So, as somebody who worked for the United Nations on 3 continents with refugees, our current track record under the Harper government is embarrassing. It's shocking. What we've recently seen with the Syrian refugee crisis is Canada's inability to live up to the promise that we believe in as Canadians. And what voters are telling me is we must act now. What I've struggled with is the Harper government continually throwing out numbers now about Iraqis or numbers of total immigration. What we have done is failed to respond to one of the most dramatic crises for refugees in Canada. And I think we should be ashamed of that.
Borys?
I'm the son and grandson of political refugees. My grandparents came with their young children out of refugee camps to this country. This was freedom's shores, and we've done so much better in the past. Take a look at 1956 in Hungary. 30,000 were brought to Canada, refugees from Hungary. And at that time, there were some people that were fear-mongering. Oh, there could be communists among them. There could be KGB spies among them. We screened, we brought them in. It was a success. Same with the 80,000 Vietnamese boat people. Unfortunately, instead of looking for solutions in this terrible humanitarian crisis, Mr. Harper has seen an electoral opportunity to fearmonger, to make Canadians scared. Well, let's talk about solutions. Why not?
We're out of time. Rob?
Well, in 1979, in the Joe Clark government, there was a crisis of boat people. And 60,000 of them came into Canada in a very short period of time and have made substantive contributions to our communities. One of them is my brother-in-law. And so I think that the fear of refugees, women and children and families, fleeing for their lives. In the case of Syria, frequently coming from middle-class, educated backgrounds where they live normal lives that they could fit in seamlessly into Canadian society is irresponsible, insensitive, and absurd.
Are we fear-mongering? Is there fear-mongering going on? Let's have a discussion.
Absolutely not. You know, this government, one of its #1 priorities, and I also have a story. You know, my father was in a gulag during the Second World War. My mother was forced labor for in Nazi Germany. We get this story. I was raised in an immigrant family. But times have changed. And times are more dangerous as well. We have terrorists overseas that have named Canada. We've had 2 terrorist incidents on our own soil last year, this month. You know, we have to be very careful about who we bring in. We want to bring people in. I agree. The Vietnamese boat people have been a tremendous community and have contributed to Canada.
So the first thing I want to say is this constant reference of every time we talk about refugees to talking about ISIL and terrorism is what's creating this idea that there's a terrorist around every corner. What it also creates, and the Harper government has been very strong on, is this idea that there are 2 types of citizenship. There's we the Canadians that are so safe and pristine, and then there's all these other Canadians, other people that might be coming in that are other and we should be afraid of. The Harper government talks about a plan for refugees, but it's the same government that talked about taking away federal funding for health care for refugees, which the Supreme Court of Canada had to say that is not a possibility, it's unconscionable, and it cannot happen. That's how much they care about refugees coming into this country.
Some of our closest allies, Germany, have taken in some 300,000. It's time to step up to the plate and help our allies. And they haven't had any terrorist attacks with those 300,000. Let's talk, instead of fear-mongering, let's talk about solutions. We could send a plane load of our bureaucrats to Turkey where the refugee camps are, set up military tents to have a processing center. Let's charter a cargo boat that could bring 1,500 or 2,000 refugees at a time. You have 10 to 14 days traveling to Halifax, where you can screen for language proficiency. You can determine where the placements would be. Let's think through solutions, how to address this issue, not fearmonger.
Rob?
Corporal Cirillo was murdered at Canada's War Memorial by a young man who was a drug addict. There's plenty of evidence to suggest he was mentally ill, and his primary objective was to draw attention to himself. He was not part of a terrorist organization.
Correct.
A terrorist organization is an organization with
What does
political
that have to do with our
objectives.
immigration issue?
Pardon?
What does that have to do with our immigration issue?
It has to do with the spread of fear. The fear that we can't let refugees into this country who actually want to come to a country that has the kinds of freedoms and Charter of Rights that we have, has the pluralistic society that we have, has a society that is tolerant of differences from the very foundations of this country. When the Protestant Anglophones in Ontario looked across the Ottawa River to the Catholic French and said, "They're us." We founded the country on differences and respecting differences and not trying to be all the same.
But how do we
And
balance the
fear,
immigration policy versus our unemployment situation? I mean, if you bring in, such as Germany did, you know, let's say 100,000 new people into Canada, we're short of jobs to begin with. The young people can't find jobs, and that's another issue we'll get to. But how do you balance that, bringing them in with, you know, a questionable employment picture?
Well, you have to bring them in to make sure that they, when they get here, that they can work. And what we're doing now is, first of all, people that come to this country ideally speak English and French. That's a requirement, because why? I grew up in a community where people didn't speak very good English for 30, 40 years, and they weren't able to integrate except at low-level jobs. So when you do that, people can integrate. But you also bring them into jobs that are lacking in certain industry areas. So you fill those needs, you fill those gaps with trained workers.
Tanya, what's your opinion on this?
So I'd say 2 things. The first thing I'd say is we have to separate immigrants from refugees. Refugees are people that are fleeing crisis and that are in need in basic needs and escape because their life is at risk. Immigrants that we bring in, we actually need, as an economist, over 300,000 immigrants to come in just to help us in our workforce, because our birth rate is not producing fast enough to work. So that's the first thing. But that's a different question around jobs and how we take care of jobs, Gord. One of the things we have to do is actually invest in training our people and having national strategies around jobs so that we don't have the rates we've seen of unemployment. We have 1.3 million people out of work in Canada, and that's thanks in great part to the Harper government.
Borys?
Well, first of all, we're not talking about bringing 100,000, we're talking about 25,000, the Liberal Party is. And when you take a look at the temporary foreign worker program, it's gone from approximately 140,000 people coming in to almost triple that number, 340, 360,000. And that's a real problem, because what it does is it depresses our wages here in Canada, and it brings people in for a couple of years almost under a false promise of maybe one day you could stay here, but after 2 years, we shift them out of the country. So that's a problem. The 25,000 isn't a problem. We have problems with the temporary foreign worker program. And in terms of creating jobs, we have a moribund economy. We learned in the 1930s during the Great Depression, Roosevelt's New Deal, what you do is you stimulate through infrastructure investments. Okay, and that's what we're saying.
The Liberal government has failed to do that. The Liberal government, which had a clear majority in 1993, failed to have that infrastructure spending. And it's unfair to say it was just the Harper government, which has actually decimated our infrastructure spending.
And we faced a $50 billion deficit.
Rob, you haven't spoken on this issue yet.
No, the Harper administration has a policy that emphasized paying your way into Canada, essentially buying your citizenship. Right. If you have enough money to so-called invest, then essentially you're an opportunist. You're not necessarily the kind of person that is going to contribute to communities for the long term. The kind of person that's going to believe in Canada, believe in our communities, believe in our heritage, believe in our national narrative. I think it encourages the kind of person who just simply is here for a good time, not a long time. The kind of person who is going to be flying a flag of convenience while traveling around the world looking for business opportunities, not necessarily investing in Canadian society.
No, I'm objecting that, because the investor class of immigrant comes in and they invest a lot of money in Canada and they provide a lot of jobs. That's the point of the investor class.
In the short term.
That's right.
But if you have that as a component rather than an emphasis, the Harperist government has it as an emphasis.
And as for the Liberal plan to bring in refugees, it's entirely unworkable.
I think is better.
And we don't have the GDP that Europe has to absorb hundreds of thousands of refugees. They have 500 million people. And it's still a problem for them right now, because this is not easy to take all those refugees, resettle them, house them, feed them. It's a very difficult task that they have at hand, and God bless the German government and others around Europe that are trying to help these people as best they can. But Canada is going to take refugees. We always have taken refugees, the highest in the world, 1 in 10 that we've resettled. We're not going to apologize for looking into Canadian safety first, making sure that the people that come to this country first of all, will do no harm to this country, and then contribute significantly when they become citizens.
The United Nations has asked us to take 10,000 a year over the next 4 years. Thomas Mulcair has said we will take those 10,000 by December. The Conservative government continues to talk about having resettled in the past, but the record is very clear. We haven't even resettled 3,000 of this amount, and Germany is a strong example of a country that can and is willing to help where they can. The Conservative government has completely failed. What I need to say as somebody who worked for the UN with refugees is my counterparts all over the world have said to me that Canada is no longer on the map when it comes to foreign aid, humanitarian assistance. Everyone that I have worked with has said that we are no longer on the table. We've lost our seat at the UN Security Council for the first time in history to Portugal, which is virtually on the point of bankruptcy. Canada's just not seen as an international player, and our reputation is lost through the Harper government.
The Progressive Conservative government of Brian Mulroney, when he left office, he was actually seriously considered as a potential head of the UN. Canada is a founding member of the UN.
That's right.
It is absurd that we would have fallen so far in our international reputation that we would not have been sitting on that Security Council, therefore at the table where these kinds of issues are being discussed.
We're not. Canada was just voted the most admired country in the world.
Back to Mr. Wolvin's earlier point about the financial class. I watched the lineup at our embassy, the consular section in Kyiv, and you saw men lining up, and you could tell by their hands, these were just hard-working men that wanted an opportunity to come to a country where they could build lives for their families. And then you'd see guys pull up in their Porsches, wearing Armani, and you know exactly what kind of person that is in a post-Soviet state and what kind of values that person has. And guess what? Those are the people that we bring in. We used to have a set of values.
I actually have to say that it's insulting to hear anybody describe what a person is by what they're wearing. And I would say to the people of Etobicoke, that is categorically disrespectful.
But it's insulting to Canadian public
places like Ukraine.
I hear anybody's yelling.
One at a time.
It's not about that. I don't have a problem around wealth. I have a problem around constant othering.
Hold on, please.
I have a problem around constant othering that's happening by the Conservative Party and that Borys just did. Talking about wealth is one thing. Talking about, I looked at the car you drive and the clothes you wear, and I can tell the kind of values that you have. I found offensive. I'm sorry, I find
we've all
that
expressed our views on this issue. Now, I want to move along to something else.
Please don't tell me that where I've spent time.
I want to talk about young people in this country. In 1980, 26% of young people were living with mom and dad while working because they couldn't afford to make it on their own with the wages they were being paid. That number is now up to 42% of young people who see no great horizon on the job section. They understand that the jobs they get will be contract, meaning there are no benefits, and many of the jobs that are offered out there are part-time. What are you going to do to provide solid employment for young people that is considered long-term, where they can actually build a career?
Well, Canada has increased since the depth of the recession, 1.3 million new jobs. The vast majority of them well-paying, good jobs, over 80% of those. We're continuing to do that. We're continuing to build our economy because it is business owners, it is small business, it is medium business that create the jobs. And by maintaining a strong economy, giving them the opportunities to prosper in their businesses, they will hire more people. But having said that, there are challenges. The world moves on. And things change in all across the world in terms of what is.
I need to respond to that. So I'm an economist and I work at the University of Toronto. So I'm working with students that are graduating with a bachelor's degree and then getting a master's and still can't find a job. We have a loss under the Harper government of 60,000 youth opportunities. We have an unemployment rate currently of 13% for youth, which is double the unemployment rate of adults. It's atrocious. What we need to do is invest federally in training for youth, as well as the federal government under Tom Mulcair is going to provide internships for youth within the federal, municipal, and provincial governments so that youth can actually work. That will provide 40,000 new jobs. So we actually need a plan to address it rather than cutting them.
Borys, you're next.
It's clearly not right that many of our young Canadians, as they graduate, their first lesson, over 40%, their first lesson is the frustration of being unable to find work while carrying huge debt loads. Their first lessons in life shouldn't be the prospect of facing personal bankruptcy. And that's why we've made it a central part of the Liberal platform. $1.3 billion invested into youth employment over the next 3 years, which will create 40,000 jobs, but also we've said we would cover a quarter of the cost for co-op and internships with companies to try to encourage even more young Canadians to have those positions so that they can garner that experience for their resumes and perhaps
do you know what I struggle with, though, around this plan?
Rob, you're next. Hold on.
Well, as I mentioned earlier, 3/4 of the population in Toronto believes that you cannot succeed because of hard work and determination. And the economic situation where the top 20% have increased their wages by 80% in the last 20 years, and the bottom 10% have increased their wages by 2% in the last 20 years, which doesn't even qualify to cover inflation. They're further behind than they were before. When you see those kinds of things bear out in our society, then you have a lack of opportunity.
Tanya, what were you saying?
I struggle with Borys's Liberal plan for one reason. What he's saying sounds wonderful, but this is the same plan that we saw in 1993 when the Liberals had a majority government, and we haven't seen those changes. We've seen massive cuts under the Liberals to education and to training and services. So my question is, you're offering all these promises at election time again, but will we actually see the Liberals deliver on those promises?
The Progressive Conservative Party believes that ultimately we should be working towards a policy where no Canadian pays for their post-secondary education. And one of the ways to do that is for government to invest more robustly in research and development in the universities so that it doesn't cost as much for them to charge students to begin with, because of course they're getting revenues. Perhaps if some of those new drugs were actually created through that program, perhaps they could get the patents and they could earn revenues for the long term at those universities that would subsidize tuition.
The NDP actually supports this investment in research and innovation in universities, as well as looking at the student debt that they're facing. I'm hearing over and over again, students that are able to even enter into low-paying jobs, they can't afford the debt. And we've talked about over and over again slashes by Harper's government to education that happened under Harper as well as under the Liberal government. And we need to be honest about that, because we actually need some change in our government. We've seen the same old thing now for the last 20 years, and we're not seeing change in our community.
No, we're making record investments in training, in research and development, and all of these areas. You know, you also have to look at the, first of all, I agree with Tanya that the Liberal government had its chance to do something, did nothing about it in subsequent Liberal governments, but you also now have to look at the provincial government, who is responsible for education and all of these things around it. What are their training plan? The unemployment rate amongst youth in Ontario is very high, and it's at the feet of Kathleen Wynne, who is doing absolutely nothing to build our universities, our manufacturing base, our businesses, and that's why largely it has climbed. I've worked with a lot of youth that come through my office to help them find career options.
Boris? You know, Ms. Mello keeps going back to 1993. Some of these young Canadians may not have even been born at that time. Let's look at 2015 and 2016 and 2017 and what we're going to do. And if you go back to that era, we had huge deficits. We had an economic situation that was in crisis, and the Liberal government had to deal with it at that time. But that's past history. Let's look at the current, and let's look at the current challenges that we face. And it's not only youth unemployment, but we have a middle class that's been working more hours per week, yet adjusted for inflation, their household incomes have not gone up. And that's why we're also proposing not only to help young Canadians, but 80% of Canada's middle class with a 7% income tax cut. That would make a significant difference.
I need to respond to that. Borys has said something that is very important that the viewers really hear. That when they were unable to help people before, it was because they were going into an economic crisis and to a deficit situation. That's where we are today. We are in a massive, massive deficit situation thanks to the Conservative government. And now Justin Trudeau is saying we're going to go into more and more deficit. As an economist, what I've heard from Borys right now is you can't make these changes in an economic crisis by going into more deficit.
No,
and what they did last time, was cut our social programs, every single one, in ways that in many ways were worse than what the Conservatives have done. And they're running on the same platform now and promising a change. And I just don't believe
the key number here
would have adopted this completely irresponsible, especially you would understand, as an economist I should hope, that it's ridiculous to say that we can't have a deficit under any circumstances. If you look at the debt to GDP ratio, that's when deficits become an issue. And in the early mid-90s, they were most certainly a critical issue. If we look at it today, like any business person would know, I'm a former small business owner, something that Mr. Harper doesn't have experience in. And I'm telling you that for cash flow, you'll do some borrowing. The Bank of Canada wouldn't even have any sort of leverage whatsoever on the economy if borrowing wasn't a major part of business. So what you do is you borrow for rebuilding, you borrow for upgrading, you borrow for expansion, you borrow for cash flow. You do so when the interest rates are low, and you do so when you've balanced GDP to debt ratio.
Let me respond to that for the NDP based on Thomas Mulcair's platform and as an economist. What we need to think about is the reason we want a balanced budget is because a deficit, and a deficit now, is a tax that we have to bear later. And there are times where deficits are important. The reason we're talking about being able to do a balanced budget now is because we need to realign our priorities. So the Liberal and Conservative parties constantly saying we are not going to have the large corporations pay a little bit more, a couple of % more, and use that funding in order to invest in sustainable long-term platforms. My worry in Thomas Mulcair's claim about deficits is when you continue to do what the Liberals do and say we're going to do it through deficit spending, eventually you have to return that money you borrowed. And what happens, and we saw in the Liberal and Conservative governments, you end up slashing programs. And what we're trying to do is have something sustainable. Tommy Douglas ran 17 balanced budgets.
Let's change gears and talk about the Senate and the scandals that have...
I'm sorry?
The Senate. We're going to talk about the Senate and the problems, expense scandals that have cropped up there. Should we be reforming the Senate? Should the Senate be elected, or should it be abolished?
Personally, I think it should be abolished. Stephen Harper has worked very hard to try to reform the Senate. He's gone out to the provinces and asked them to elect senators. Only Alberta did that. And when that senator was elected, he appointed him. We've gone to the Supreme Court and asked what we can do to reform the Senate. And the Supreme Court said, you must have the agreement of all 10 provinces. The reality is that's not going to happen. My view of this is I would prefer to abolish the Senate entirely.
Tanya?
The NDP has been very clear. Thomas Mulcair says we need to abolish the Senate. We need to have members that are elected and not appointed. The scandal that we've seen, not just in the Senate, but with the Conservative government, the number of members that are under investigation by our courts and by the RCMP is appalling. It's a shame to this country. And we need to have representatives that are elected that actually speak for people versus appointed people that speak for parties in a partisan way.
Borys?
It's not just the waste of the Senate, it's the corrupting influence of the Senate. It's unfortunately, it's a repository for bagmen, backroom boys, and they're there until they're 75. So we have a catch-22. We have a Supreme Court decision, we have a constitution that basically says all the provinces have to agree, and there's only one province, Saskatchewan, that's in agreement to get rid of the Senate. Quebec will never agree to eliminate the Senate. So what do? Let's make it democratic. Let's see if we can't use this as an opportunity to elect a Senate, and let's elect it not in this first past the post system. Let's elect it in a proportional way.
Rob?
Let's bring real democracy to the Senate.
The Senate was not an upper house. It wasn't a Canadian version of the House of Lords. The Senate was not an American transplanted thing. It was something that was stylized and created specifically for Canadians. It existed to protect the interests of the smaller, less popular regions from being overwhelmed by the larger regions. It was a sober second thought, not because there's a bunch of rich old men that know better.
That's history.
Than
Should
the
we
great
abolish
unwashed.
it, or should...
The whole point is that it existed for a purpose. And that purpose is not being fulfilled by the current situation. It has been abused by successive administrations.
Therefore?
I would suggest that it absolutely must be reformed, but it must be reformed to realize the perfectly excellent benefits that it was intended. I would say that the Crown should appoint from a short list 2/3 approved by their respective provincial legislature. That would allow for a period of vetting. That would allow for a senator to be firmly based of support in that region that he is supposed to represent, or she, as the case may be. And that would involve bipartisan support because it's a 2/3 majority that I'm proposing. What you would end up having is you would have senators who were not grubby politicians necessarily. They were people who have been well vetted in their own constituency, their own province.
All right, so we
I
all
would
agree
suggest
on
that they caucus by
reform
region
or abolition, one
rather
or the
than
other.
by party.
But you know, you two, you three represent federal parties that have consistently said, you know, we've got to do something about this, and yet you all have senators in the Senate, and you know, there's been no talk of abolition, there's been no talk of reform. So what does the future hold for the Senate?
Well, we tried to put through legislation that would limit a senator's term to 9 years rather than effectively to 75 for potentially decades. But, you know, I have to answer Mr. Wrzesnewskyj on the proportional system. That was tried, or at least floated by Mr. McGuinty back in, I think, 2007, and that proportional system was rejected outright by the people of Ontario. But also, The kryptonite to a proportional system is the fringe parties that can get in as well. Look at Greece. Greece has got a party called the Golden Dawn that holds about 6% of the vote, and they're a fascist organization.
Yeah. And beyond that, can I respond to proportional representation and say this? Canadians want proportional representation. We currently have a majority Conservative government that the majority of Canadians didn't vote for. I would also like to see a Green Party in the Senate. We need to have people's votes count, and it's dangerous because what happens with this first past the post system is you're trying to get the worst candidate out, and you're not actually voting for what you want because you don't have a voice in your government.
The Green Party is not a fringe party. The Green Party has some valid policies that should be looked at, and they should have representation. And let's look at Senate reform as an opportunity. The Liberal Party doesn't have any senators in their caucus anymore. Mr. Trudeau took leadership on this, and he said there are no more Liberal senators. They were taken away out of our caucus. So that actually, within the parameters, within what we could do, showed clear leadership on this file.
All right, I think we run out of gas on the Senate. I'd like to change gears and talk about, we were talking about refugees and we were talking about immigration just a few minutes ago. What about this notion that an immigrant who comes to this country and becomes a naturalized Canadian and engages in his or herself in an act of terrorism, should their citizenship automatically be revoked, taken away, and they should be deported?
Yes, if they're dual citizens. Under the UN Charter, we cannot strip a citizen, any citizen of all their citizenships because it's illegal to leave somebody stateless. But if you come to this country, for example, and you perpetrate heinous crimes on Canadians, you want to put forth an act of terrorism, murder, serious crimes, you are not a Canadian by my definition, and you should do your time, and then we should deport you.
Tanya.
What's clear to me here is this constant fear-mongering of creating two levels of citizenship. You have no right to be here if you do anything that we don't think is deemed Canadian, and we will remove your citizenship. I am a lawyer. We have a legal apparatus that deals with these kinds of crimes. And that apparatus has been very successful in taking care of people and putting them in jail and prison where necessity drives. This bill, C-24, has to be seen in context with C-51, that also talks about governments having abilities to go and look at people that we think are terrorists and take away their rights, take away due process. It's outrageous. And
Borys?
It's really a slippery slope. Mr. Opitz has said that dual citizens, but we already know of a case of a Canadian-born criminal who the government is looking to deport to a country that he doesn't know, that he never lived in. So it's really a slippery slope. And you can't create two categories of citizenship. And we have a criminal justice system. If you want certain categories of criminal acts, some of the penalties strengthened, do that. Do that legislatively. But you cannot create two categories of citizens.
Rob, you're next.
I would be adamantly opposed to the idea that somebody born in Canada, just because their parents were born somewhere else, can be stripped of their citizenship. I think that if somebody who is a Canadian commits a crime, then they go to jail and they do the time. We don't import our problem to other countries.
All right.
I also think it's important that we bring up C-51. This is part and parcel of the same idea of creating the dual citizenship that Borys just talked about, but the Liberals voted for. And I think that's something that we need to talk about. What is it that we're saying as a society, that our government has the right to have spy agencies to detain and arrest people without just cause and without due process? And I think that there are certain groups that get targeted by these kinds of legislations. And so you have a Liberal Party that was vehemently against that and talking so much about supporting immigrants, and in the end they voted for it. So we have various forms of legislation right now that are happening that are creating the sense of dual citizenship, and what it's doing is creating a fear of people that if I do anything wrong,
83% of Canadians, and in fact 85% of immigrants to this country, agree with our government that if you do a heinous act of terrorism or serious crimes, We're talking about serious crimes, the most serious, that you should be deported and stripped of your citizenship. And we've done it, by the way, to war criminals in the past. There is a precedent for this. It's happened in Canada before, and everybody was okay with that.
Lied on their applications when they came from another country and wanted to get into Canada. That's a different situation from someone born and raised in this country who runs afoul of the law.
85%
like every
of
other
immigrants agree
Canadian
with
that
us.
does that.
I'm going to hold you there, and we're now
jail.
going to engage in closing statements. Now, we went in a specific order to begin with. We will go in a reverse order to end it. And Rob, you will be first with your closing statement. Please proceed.
Hi, I'm Rob Wolvin. I represent the PC Party. I'm basically here to carry the flag for a more centrist, small c conservative party that offered itself as a pragmatic, conservative, honest, sincere, and national alternative to the Liberal Party or the NDP Party or the Harperist Reform Alliance Party. We still exist. We're still an option.
Borys?
Fellow Etobians, it was an honor to have been able to work on your behalf in the past. I worked hard on issues in our communities. I worked diligently as a legislator in Parliament on legislation that would make a difference in millions of Canadian lives. On October 19th, it would be an incredible honor to once again be able to serve on your behalf and on behalf of Canada.
Tanya de Mello.
Tanya de Mello from Etobicoke Centre, this is what I would say. We have a Conservative government that has left our country in economic ruin, and the Liberals that preceded them didn't do much better. They have slashed our programs and our social programs that made this country the place it is today. So when I see signs now that say, bring back Borys, bring back the Liberals, I want you to ask yourself, what are we bringing back? We want governments that deliver on the promises that they make during elections. So on October 19th, vote for Tanya de Mello, vote for Thomas Mulcair, vote for change.
Ted Opitz.
Thank you, Gord, and I'd like to thank the people of Etobicoke Centre for allowing me to be your MP, and I hope to do so again. I've worked very hard over the last 4 years to bring prosperity to our seniors, to our families, to ensure that we have a strong, safe neighborhood. I've worked with the police on various initiatives. This is a government that is going to work hard at making sure this entire nation is prosperous. We have one of the top G7 economies in the world. We're one of the most respected nations in the world. And Etobicoke Centre is going to get the smart track and better transit that they've asked for a long time that the Liberals never delivered. Thank you.
We should mention that there was another participant who was invited to take part in this debate today, and that was Sean Rizvi of the Green Party, but he declined the invitation. Ladies and gentlemen, thank you very much for joining us on the local campaign. The airtimes for other debates can be found on RogersTV.com. I'm Gord Martineau. Bye for now.